maybe a bit abstract sounding. Domain walls in field theory.
Right. Sounds complex, but the basic idea isn't too bad.
Okay, so picture like a line, a one-dimensional thing like a kink or a blip in a field. A localized structure.
Exactly, like a crease in a sheet of paper.
And then you imagine that sheet, that space, extends into more dimensions. That crease, that 1D structure, now becomes a kind of wall stretching through those extra dimensions, a domain wall.
That's the picture, and that energy from the original 1D kink, it gets smeared out.
Smeared out how?
Well, it becomes an energy per unit area, or volume, depending on the dimensions. We call that the tension of the wall.
Tensions, okay, like surface tension on water, but maybe more fundamental.
Sort of, yeah. It's an inherent energy cost for that wall existing.
Got it.
Yeah.
But that's the classical picture, right?
Yeah.
What happens when quantum mechanics comes into play?
Ah, yes. The quantum world. Always making things more interesting.
Or complicated. All those quantum fluctuations, virtual particles popping in and out,
Right.
they must affect this tension, right? Especially in those extra dimensions around the wall.
They absolutely do. And calculating those quantum contributions, that's the tricky part. That's the core challenge here.
And this is where the paper we looked at comes in. It offers a way to tackle this.
Exactly. It dives into something called spectral methods, a really powerful technique.
Spectral methods. Okay, what's the angle? How do they work?
Well, instead of trying to sum up all the effects directly, which can be messy, it looks at how the quantum fluctuations scatter off the domain wall.
Scattering, like bouncing waves off something to figure out its shape.
Pretty much. You analyze how the waves of quantum fluctuations are changed by the wall, and that tells you about the energy shifts, the quantum corrections to the tension. It uses scattering data.
Okay, that sounds clever. Less direct, maybe.
Less direct summing, but it captures the physics really efficiently. The paper focuses on two key models where this is studied.
Right, the sine-Gordon and the Kink models. These seem to be workhorses in this field.
They really are foundational models for these kinds of structures.
And they're not just theoretical curiosities. They show up in the real world.
Oh, definitely. Sine-Gordon, for example, pops up in cosmology, thinking about how fields might have settled in the very early universe.
Early universe, okay. And elsewhere.
Material science, too. Things like Josephson junctions, related to superconductivity, and the Kink model. Also cosmology, but condensed matter physics, statistical mechanics.
So understanding these basic walls and their quantum tension has pretty broad relevance then.
Absolutely. It connects fundamental theory to potentially observable phenomena.
So our mission for this deep dive, understand how these spectral methods work, how they calculate the quantum tension, especially for these sine-Gordon Kink models.
And importantly, why this matters.
Exactly. Why should you, listening, care about domain wall tension? Well, as we'll get into, particularly for cosmology, the exact value can be crucial.
It really can. Too much tension from domain walls in the early universe could have, well, messed things up. Led to a very different cosmos than we see.
So getting the quantum corrections right is potentially quite important for our cosmological models.
Precisely. And another strength of these spectral methods, the paper highlights, is how they handle infinities.
Renormalization. The bane of quantum field theory calculations.
Always. You get these infinite answers you need to tame. There are different ways to do it, different renormalization schemes.
And different schemes can sometimes give different answers, right? Which is worrying.
It can be. But this spectral method provides a consistent way to apply various schemes and compare them. It handles the subtraction of infinities systematically.
Okay, so it's robust in that sense. The paper mentions something called the interface formalism and vacuum polarization energy.
Right, the interface formalism is part of this setup.
Yeah.
And the vacuum polarization energy, that's basically the main quantum effect we're after.
Is that like the energy shift caused by all the virtual particle activity? Because the wall is there, it polarizes the vacuum around it.
That's a great way to think about it, yeah. It's the leading quantum correction to that classical energy we talked about earlier.
And they test this method first, right? In simpler cases.
They do. They check it in lower dimensions, 1+1 dimensions, where sometimes you can get exact analytical answers, just to make sure the method works before going to higher dimensions.
Smart. Build confidence. And a key mathematical piece seems to be the Jost function. What role does that play?
The Jost function is a tool from scattering theory. It neatly packages up information about how waves scatter off a potential.
The potential here being the domain wall itself.
Exactly. The wall acts as a potential for the quantum fluctuations. The Jost function, particularly looking at it in the complex momentum plane, tells you about bound states.
Fluctuations trapped by the wall.
Yes, and also the continuum states, the ones that just scatter past. But the neat trick is you don't have to explicitly find all the bound state energies. The properties of the Jost function itself, its phase, contain that information implicitly. It simplifies the calculation quite a bit.
Ah, so it's like a mathematical shortcut built on scattering theory.
Nice.
It's quite elegant, yeah.
Then the paper really digs into the details for the Kink model, looking at different renormalization schemes, comparing their spectral method results.
Right. They look at how you define the vacuum state and subtract off its energy. Different schemes make different choices there. Things like minimal subtraction or no tadpole.
Different ways to handle the infinities and define the baseline energy.
Exactly. But what's neat is that the core spectral calculation, the part involving the Jost function and momentum integrals, stays largely the same.
So the method itself is flexible.
Very. Switching between schemes often just involves changing how you treat the simpler perturbative parts, the bits you might calculate with Feynman diagrams. This makes comparing schemes much cleaner.
Okay, so what did they actually find? Did the method work in those simpler checks? It worked beautifully for both sine-Gordon and the Kink model in 1+1 dimensions, one space, one time. The quantum tension they calculated using their spectral method with a specific scheme.
The no tadpole one.
Yes, that one. It perfectly matched known analytical results. That's a strong validation.
Perfect agreement. That's what you want to say.
Absolutely. And they noted something interesting technically, too. Using a particular way of subtracting infinities involving two subtractions instead of one, it made their numerical calculations converge much, much faster. Practical advantage there.
So validated in low dimensions, faster calculations, sounds promising. What about the more physically relevant case, like 3+1 dimensions, especially for cosmology?
Right, 3 space dimensions. They focused on the Kink model there. They found that using a standard minimal subtraction scheme, the purely perturbative part of the calculation actually slightly reduces the quantum correction size.
Reduce it, okay. And how did their overall results stack up against what others had found before?
That's where it gets particularly interesting. They found agreement with one previous study's results, but significant disagreement with another major study on the Kink model tension.
Disagreement. Why? That's usually a sign something needs closer inspection.
Indeed. The authors of this paper argued the discrepancy likely comes down to how that other study handled the renormalization, specifically the ultraviolet divergences, the high-energy infinities.
So they think the way the other group tamed the infinities wasn't quite right.
That's their argument. They suggest that simply rescaling the classical mass parameter, which was done in the other work, isn't sufficient to properly renormalize the theory at this order, the one-loop level.
So a subtle point about the formal procedure of renormalization.
Exactly. Their spectral method, they argue, incorporates the necessary counterterms, the mathematical fixes for infinities in a more direct and consistent way within the calculation itself.
And they showed this method plays nicely with other standard techniques too, like dimensional regularization.
Yes. Dimensional regularization is a very common way to handle infinities in field theory. They showed how you can integrate it directly into their spectral framework.
So you can use this spectral approach with different tools for renormalization.
Right. It lets you analytically calculate the corrections within various schemes, choose your energy scale for renormalization. It underlines the flexibility and, they argue, the correctness of their approach.
Okay, so across all these calculations, different models, different dimensions, different schemes, was there a general trend for the quantum correction to the tension?
Yes, a very consistent one. The quantum corrections they found were generally negative.
Negative, meaning the quantum effects reduced the domain wall's tension compared to the classical value.
That's right. The fluctuations effectively lower the energy cost of the wall.
And that's significant. Why?
Well, especially in cosmology. Remember we said too much tension could be a problem.
Right, it could dominate the universe's energy inappropriately.
If the quantum corrections are negative, it means the total tension is lower than you might naively think based just on the classical part.
Ah, so it potentially loosens the constraints. You could have slightly stronger fundamental fields, higher vacuum energy scales, without necessarily running into cosmological problems from domain walls.
Precisely. It could raise the upper limits on things like the vacuum expectation values of scalar fields, which are fundamental parameters in particle physics and cosmology. Getting this sign right is crucial.
Okay, let's try to wrap this up then. We've dug into spectral methods. The core idea is using scattering data
Right, how quantum fluctuations bounce off the domain wall.
to calculate the quantum changes to the wall's tension.
Yeah.
And it seems pretty efficient and handles the messy renormalization stuff robustly.
Yeah, handling different schemes, showing strong agreement with known results in simpler cases.
And for the sine-Gordon and Kink models, the main finding is these quantum corrections tend to make the tension lower. They're negative.
Which matters. The research also really highlighted the importance of getting the renormalization right, comparing their consistent spectral approach with other results, and pinpointing potential discrepancies.
And the big takeaway for cosmology is that nailing down this quantum tension is genuinely important. It feeds into our models of the early universe, helps set limits on fundamental physics.
Definitely. And it's not just these two models, right? The paper suggests that these spectral techniques have legs.
Meaning they could be used elsewhere.
Yeah, they should be applicable to other situations with similar spatial symmetries, other types of walls, maybe defects in condensed matter systems. It opens doors for future work.
Okay, so here's something to chew on as we finish. If these subtle quantum effects, these corrections to seemingly simple things like domain walls, can actually influence our picture of the entire universe's evolution, what other hidden quantum phenomena might be out there, quietly shaping reality on the largest scales in ways we haven't even thought of yet?
It really makes you think about that deep connection, doesn't it? Between the incredibly small, the quantum, and the incredibly large, the cosmos.
Definitely gives you pause. Thanks for exploring this deep dive with us.